There's a story about a rabbi. You've probably heard the story, but it bears repeating. There was a couple that was having some difficulty, and so they came to the rabbi to air their grievances and to see if they could find a resolution. And the husband began the conversation, and he started to tell the rabbi all the things wrong that his wife had been doing for all these years, and the rabbi listened intently to the husband's story. And when the husband was finished, the rabbi looked at him carefully and said, "You know, you're right." And then the woman, the wife, told her story, and she proceeded to tell in four-part harmony all the things wrong that the husband had done to her over all the years. The rabbi looked at her very intently, and he said, "You know, you're right." And the little shamus in the corner, who was listening to all of this, jumps up and says, "Rabbi, if he's right, how can she be right? And if she's right, how can he be right?" And of course the rabbi looked at him very intently and said, "You know, you're right too." Behind the joke is really a very, very important concept in learning Torah. There can be many right ways to study the Torah, to understand the various passages in the Torah, various passages in the commentaries, various passages in the sages. And we have a phrase for that, Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chayim. Both of these and those, are the words of God. There are so many ways to understand the words of the Torah. And we happen to have a wonderful, wonderful illustration of this point in the Torah portion that we just read last week on Simchas Torah and this past Shabbos. And it's the very first passage in the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim eis hashamayim ve'eis haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Two of our prime commentators, Rashi and the Ramban, disagree as to the meaning of this passage. In fact, there are two disagreements. Rashi says that the Torah shouldn't have started with the Genesis story at all. The Torah is a book of instruction for Jews. It teaches us how to live. The book of instruction is really 613 mitzvos. The Torah should have started with a mitzvah. In fact, it should have started with the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, which is the mitzvah to establish Rosh Chodesh, and we happen to have Rosh Chodesh tonight. And that mitzvah was given to Moshe and Aaron when they were still in Egypt, and they were to establish the month and the calendar so that they could establish when Pesach was going to come, and 2 weeks later was going to be Pesach, and the redemption from Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, was going to occur 2 weeks later. And that was the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, and Rashi says that's the way the Torah should have opened. And Rashi gives a reason why the Torah tells the creation story. The Ramban disagrees vociferously with Rashi, and he says, no, the Torah had to start with creation, because everything in creation is the foundation of our faith. It's the foundation of our emunah. It presupposes, first of all, it teaches us that God exists, and that God created the world, and the world didn't come into being by itself. And that there was a plan for the world, and that God sustains the world, and that the divine providence is engaged in the world, and that human beings have will and can choose. And if they choose good, they're going to be rewarded, and if they choose evil, they're going to be punished. And all of these things are all contained in the stories of Bereshis, in the whole book of Bereshis, beginning with the creation story. And so that the Torah had to start here. This is how we live. That's the Ramban's opinion. Not like Rashi. Most of the commentators, by the way, side with the Ramban, which is unusual, but that's how it is. There's a second disagreement and that is in the words itself. Rashi says that the word Bereshis does not mean in the beginning. We always translate, and I translated it for you, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and that's how the Ramban translates it. Rashi says the word Bereshis cannot mean, and he uses various grammatical proofs and proofs from other passages in the Torah and in Tanakh, that Bereshis cannot mean in the beginning. And so it means something else, and Rashi says, really this verse is coming to teach us something homiletical. It's a figure of speech. It's ein hamikra hazeh omer ela dorsheni. We have to only look to this passage of Bereshis to learn various things from it, but it's not telling us a Genesis story. It's a very unusual interpretation. And again, the Ramban disagrees and says, no. Bereshis means in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and the story is told as is, as it's told. And one of Rashi's points, and the Ramban agrees with this, is that in the telling of how the world was created in the 6 days of creation and on the 7th day, which is Shabbos, that there's really no way to understand what really happened there. First of all, we don't have a sense of time. 6 days weren't 6 days. Our days are based on sun and moon and stars, which were created on the 4th day, so how could you have a day on the 1st day? And we have no idea what the time measurement was, and we have no idea how really these things happened. But the Ramban says that the whole concept of teaching us about creation is to show us that when Hashem created the world, he started with the most simple and minute and elemental, I think we would call it energy. Some would say force, or some would even say matter, but it's probably energy. By he or, although we interpret that or, that light, as a spiritual light, but it could be interpreted as a physical light. And as some scientist once told me, the only constant in the whole universe is the speed of light. And so that the whole world is really based on Vayehi Or. So the Ramban says to us, we can't understand everything. It's true what Rashi says, we can't understand everything, but we do have a basic notion as to how creation occurred. And Rashi says, because we really can't understand it, so we have to learn different things from it. So it's a whole different approach as to how to study Bereshis. And so I ask you, who's right? Rashi or Ramban? And the answer, of course, is they're both. And that's why we all come to CTC, to understand and to learn that Rashi and Ramban are both right, and that we can study the Torah and look into the Torah and stretch our minds and seek the truth of the Torah wherever it can be found, in whatever interpretation, in whatever opinion, as long as it remains within the confines of the Torah that Hashem gave us. So at the beginning of this new season, I want to wish all of you much success in your Torah studies, much success to the CTC, and I want to thank you again for allowing me to share my thoughts with you.